Okay, last time we talked a little bit about some of the primary texts and some of the archaeology that shows how the government is being organized and what it's doing. And I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the development of the different classes that are showing up in the primary texts, which are the consuls and the plebeians, and just talk a little bit about what. Okay, well, if you look at the Roman state dating to sometime in the 500s, maybe pushing into the 400s BC, there seems to be four major groupings. And one of the more major groups is the family. Paterfamilias just means the father of the family. And the family structure seems to be replicated within the government, where you've got the father with a say of everything and then everyone else sitting below. And that's pretty much how the Roman government set itself up, where you've got the consuls acting as the fathers and then everyone else below who needs to listen to these people. You've got three other categories too. Some of them are kind of fuzzy in terms of what we know about them. One we certainly know about is the curia. And these people were the wealthy, almost certainly the wealthy men who came from different areas, got together, and they talked about what was happening. And as you can see here in my note, the primary focus was on wills and adoptions. And if you think about what a will is, it's determining who is going to inherit property, which is really what a will is for during this period. What the curia seems to be organized to deal with is the transference of property. And what we guess from later periods is that the curia were the wealthy. They're keeping their wealth within their own families, and that's really what they are dealing with. You also have the tribes. These were based on geography, and new tribes were formed, especially when colonists were sent out when the Romans started expanding. So you get different tribes. You also get something called a gens, which means sort of like family structure or a clan. As I put, you're not quite sure what that means at this early period, but these are the four major groupings. Okay, if you look at the social structure during this period, you have something that Roman scholars call the orders. And this is really two main groups of people, made up of two main groups of people. The patricians, or the fathers, and I just mentioned this group, they're the wealthiest. You also have everybody else, and these are the plebeians. And if you remember, in the last lecture, we talked about how the plebeians end up gaining their power. These are the common people, everybody else. Now, there's this sort of myth out there that the plebeians were all very poor, and we know that definitely is not the case. Most of them were poor. Most people in the ancient world were, but you can have a very wealthy plebeian, and then these wealthy plebeians will get themselves inserted into the government structure that I'll talk about. From about 500 to the 300s BC, at least as I put here, according to tradition, and what I mean by that is the written documents, you have a definite division between the patricians and the plebeians. And so one example is that the patricians controlled all the religious rites. So they were the priests, they went into the temples, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. But controlling the religion was a very powerful position, because they're essentially sort of telling the fortune of what will happen in the future. We know that in this period, the plebeians weren't allowed to marry into this class. So the patricians kept their power, they kept their land within their own families, and you weren't allowed to have a plebeian enter into your family. Now this will change. I do want to talk a little bit about what is called the Roman Constitution. One thing to remember is that this Constitution was not written down like ours is today in the United States. This is really a set of traditions. And what the Constitution is for the Romans is really the government structure and who does what. So again, this is really based on tradition. A lot of this doesn't get written down till a lot later. Now, according to tradition, you have consuls at the very beginning. So I had you read a bit of Dionysius of Halicarnassus in the last lecture on the formation of the consuls. There were probably people who were ruling Rome during this period. Whether they were given the title of consul, we're not quite sure, but at least we know in the early 300s that there were two consuls. So if you think back to the pre-Republican period, you've got a king, and then whatever happens, they get rid of their kings, and then they have two people ruling over them. These people rule with something called imperium, which is essentially almost unlimited power to do what they wanted to, and citizens had to obey them. If you look down at the bottom of this list, there's something called lictors. These were 12 people who accompanied the consuls at all times. They carried a bundle of sticks, which is probably representing hitting people who aren't behaving. And then you have these sort of ceremonial axes that are also carried with the consuls. So when they step outside the religious center of the city, then their powers change a little. They still will carry the imperium. I mentioned that the consuls will be doing all the religious rites. Over time, what happens, and we'll talk about this sort of struggle of the orders, you do get plebeians getting into a position where they can do religious rites. We know that the consuls were elected for 1 year, and in the early period, that's what happens. So you get two consuls, both elected for 1 year, and then they're out, and then someone else comes along. What this ended up doing is giving power to the wealthy people. So if you've got a large number of wealthy families, they all want to be consuls because it comes with this great pride of what you're doing. If they're elected every year, your family may have a chance to do this. Now later on, we'll see that consuls can be elected multiple times depending on what's going on. These people really led the government. So of course they've got civil duties, which includes the religious aspect. They also have military duties. So the consuls could be sent out to fight somewhere, and they usually did this. And I've already talked about the lictors and what they're doing. Now you've got the Senate. So you've got these patricians that are ruling. You've got the consuls who are at the top of the government. What happens to the rest of the wealthy people? So what happens is they created something called the Senate. Now we don't know the official time period of when the Senate starts, but we do know, at least based on textual evidence, that the pre-Republican period, you've got people who were advising the king. So what most scholars think is that that advisory role carried down and then actually became the Senate. Sometimes you've got 300. Over time, this changes depending on who the consul is and what kind of power structure they want around them. That number can expand up to 900 at certain points, but in the beginning, we think it was about 300. Now, starting in the 300s BC, you can have patricians and plebeians on the Senate. Now, one thing to remember about the Senate is that they do not pass law. They're really an advisory board that the consuls will go to talk about things, and the Senate will give its advice on something. Also in terms of going to war. You do have voting in the Senate, but as I put here, it's not a democratic vote. It's not like one person, one vote. Usually what happens is the most distinguished, and sometimes that's the older person, will speak, give his advice, and then most everyone else will sort of follow in line with what the eldest person would like to do. Now, sometimes that didn't happen, but that's usually what happens in the Senate. You do have something called the ladder of offices, the cursus honorum. And what this is, it's a way, or it's really just, this image shows a map of the different routes to get to these top positions. So if you look on here, let me see if I can write on here again. You've got the lowest section, which can be patricians or plebeians. On the plebeian side, you've got the office of a tribune, which is really a protector of the plebeians. You have something called a quaestor. Now, this is usually the spot where the wealthy sons will start off in. And this is financial. So this is taking care of the finances of their city that they happen to be living in. The next role that they can move into is something called an aedile. And as I put here, these are the people who are responsible for maintaining the cities. So these jobs were not easy, maintaining the streets, the sewers, the temples, and so on. And then the next stage up is a praetor. These are judges, military officers. They do carry imperium. So if you remember, imperium was they demand total obedience, and it's expected that you are obedient to them. And then you finally reach the consul. And these numbers here are showing you how many in the early period you would actually have. So down at the bottom, you've got 20 quaestors, and then the numbers sort of get smaller as you rise up, which means there's actually more competition for these particular roles. So you've got the consul. You can also have something called a proconsul. And usually the proconsuls are people who are consuls, but will leave the bounds of Rome and do something else, like go on a military campaign or something like that. There is two offices after this. So remember, the consuls are elected for 1 year. When they're done with their office, they want to keep doing something. So some of these consuls could become dictators if there's a need for it. And remember, we talked about this. This is usually a military need. You also have an office of the censor. And you, just like the word census, censor, this person would keep track of the population of the cities. They would do other things as well, but that's mostly their main job. So this is the ladder of offices that you would start off at the bottom and then rise up. I should say not everyone followed this particular ladder. It just depends on the time period we're talking about. Okay, in terms of elections, so you do have elections in Republican Rome. But I do want to make it clear that we're not talking about the way that we vote, so one person, one vote system. So you've got 3 voting bodies, and I'll sort of discuss these in just a second. You've got the Centuriate Assembly, the Tribal Assembly of the Plebeians, and the Tribal Assembly of the People. So, and within these groups, you have certain social classes. So the Centuriate Assembly, you've got the consuls. And as you know, they are the highest people who are controlling the government. You've got the censors and you've got the praetors. So now this is where you start seeing the creation of laws. So they actually enacted laws. They are the ones who declared whether you have war and peace. They would make the decisions in terms of death penalties. Now, voting. So how would you actually vote? The votes would take place with the wealthiest in each group voting first, and then what normally would happen is almost like what we talked about with the Senate, where the older, more distinguished person would speak, and then usually everyone would say, okay, we agree, and then this whole Centuriate Assembly would have one vote, say, yes, we are going to war, and then it would go to the other assemblies. So the Tribal Assembly of the Plebeians, this was an assembly that was plebeian only until later, when the patricians were allowed into this. So they had something called plebiscites, which, as you can see from where this word comes from, plebiscites. Now it's interesting, they could also pass their own laws, but when they passed their laws were only for the plebeians until 287 BC, when their laws that were passed covered everyone, including the consuls. We'll talk a little bit about this. Now, these tribunes, I mentioned this before, they were designed to protect the plebeians. And they had some pretty powerful roles in terms of being a tribune. So they could veto the action of anybody. They could suspend elections. As you can see here, they could reject advice from the Senate. Being a tribune was extremely powerful, and it was a way to balance out the power between the consuls and the plebeians. And then finally, you've got the Tribal Assembly of the People. These are the quaestors, the aediles. In the early period, you've got 6 military officers, which were the military tribunes, and they also enacted their own laws. So you have this sort of voting structure, but each group, once they decide on their vote, gets one vote. Okay, now I've been talking about how over time you get, say for example, a plebeian who can marry into a consular family or a patrician family. this happens over time, and some scholars call this the struggle of the orders. And as I put up here, this is a hot debate on whether a struggle actually happened. If you look at some of the early laws, and I'll show you some of these in just a bit, you have a firm division between the consuls and patricians and the plebeians. But the plebeians wanted their power. So how did the plebeians actually get their power? Some people call this the struggle. So as I put here, literary tradition. So you've got Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus talking about how the plebeians were complaining and how they move out onto another hill and they decide they're not going to fight for the patricians, and the patricians get worried, you know, what happens if there's a fight and we don't have a military? So they said, okay, we'll allow you to have your assemblies and make your own laws and so on. This, according to tradition, led to this compromise in 445 BC, where the two groups came together and didn't quite share power, because the consuls were always in power and the patricians were always in power, but it gave an outlet for the plebeians to control at least some aspects of their own society. Now what ended up happening is you have the creation of the law of 12 tables. Originally this was 10. I've given you a reference here to Livy, which is talking about the addition of laws 11 and 12. And within this table, you have lots of little sub-laws. So I'll show you some in just a bit. If you look through this, you can see the first law was about procedure and what would happen in court trials. Table 3, you've got debt, which was a really big issue during this period. And so these laws on these tables were written down around 450. I give a date here, around 451 to 449. These were written down because the plebeians were demanding, what is the law? So if you were in trouble and you were a plebeian, you would go to a patrician, and the patrician would say, okay, this is what the law is. But you get to a point where what's tradition and what's a real law? This is why the laws were written down, and it really helped the plebeians. So, for example, you can look at Table 1, which is about the court system, and Law 1. And you can stop this and read through this, but when anyone summons another before the trial of a judge, you must appear. This is almost like a subpoena these days. And if you don't appear, what happens? That's what Law 2 of Table 1 is all about. So go ahead and stop the video and you can take a look at that law. And then if you look at Table 4, which is about the rights of families, and in particular, the right of the paterfamilia, or the father of the family. If you look at Law 1, they had extreme amount of power within their family, life and death over their children. And you can see, though, that fathers can sell their sons into slavery. But if you do that 3 times to the same person, you get them back, then they're independent. And as Law 2 says, you can see this person is free. The father can put a child to death, put a son to death who might have some type of what they would call deformity, and so on. And there, as a lot of these things, there's a lot of debate about what this type of law in terms of life and death over the children actually meant. Certainly what it probably means at face value is that a father could kill his own children if he had a reason. Now, what we're finding is that you just can't willy-nilly kill your children. There has to be a really good reason for it. And so there's some type of structure put into place to make sure that, fathers aren't killing their children just for very little things. Okay, and then the last slide I have here is, I want you to really think about, why were these laws useful to the plebeians? Like, why did they demand the patricians write down their laws, and what benefit does that give to them? So I really want you to think about that.